All right, welcome. Oh, I always hit that mute button. Welcome back to Seaside Joe. I'm Kenneth Arthur, and with me today, John Gilbert of Field Goals. He is a salary cap expert, if he doesn't mind me saying so. And Field Goals is very lucky to have him talking about the Seahawks salary cap. It's one of the things that building a football team, we've gotten into more and more each year as fans, as we sort of have these websites, which for those of you watching, you can see I've got overthecap.com up. And having these websites really allows everybody to sort of play GM with a team, play financial analyst, and to dissect what it is that the teams that they root for have, and what they might be able to spend, and where they might run into issues. And at the same time, you see the Saints go from like 80 million over the cap to they've got plenty of cap space. So it's kind of confusing in that way too, because it's like an illusion at any given time. And that's what I want to get into here with John. And, the Seahawks, over here at overthecap.com, it says they have just under 13 million in cap space. First of all, John, do you have any recommendations for people out there between the websites, Over the Cap, Sport Trek, anything that you feel is makes the most sense?
I like over the cap, excuse me, over the cap, and simply there. The majority of the NFL information, at least for Spot Track, they take a lot of their. My understanding is they scrape a lot of their information off of over the cap, or at least they have in the past. So,
Oh,
they may they just kind of reproduce a lot of what Jason and his team over the cap put together. So I prefer that's the one that grew up with. I started using it when I was a commenter at Field Goals, and that's the one that I stick with. So.
yeah. And I mean, it's so interesting to use like the cap calculator. I always find myself back in those moments where you can start doing the cuts and the trades, and just those shortcuts to like restructuring a contract. That stuff used to be so complicated, and I don't want to downplay what it must be like in the office of these teams, and moving that stuff around. Because it almost makes the insane amount of money that players make, and that, not that they're not worth it, because the money is coming into the NFL, and the players deserve a significant chunk of that, but it's just like these huge dollar figures that most of us won't earn in our entire lives. And it sort of it makes it seem like, oh well, it's just 7 million here and 12 million there, and it's like that's so much money. But for the purposes of like these calculators and teams, it's not that much. So when we talk about the Seahawks, I said 12.958 million according to overthecap.com. How much of that, how accurate do you think that is at this point? How much of that money must be allocated for amenities, certain things in the future?
Well, there's a couple adjustments that need to be made. There's a piece of that that's gonna that'll go towards rookies to the draft picks. They'll need, I believe, because they've already got. Let's see. Yeah, there'll be about 5 million of that will come off for draft picks, but then they'll pick up another 5 million when Carlos Dunlap comes off the books on June 2nd. So that's kind of a wash. They're really in that 12, $13 million range in terms of, money that they actually do have available to spend if they wanted to go out right now and spend cap. They
Yeah.
would be able, not right now. They could do it in June. Let me rephrase that. I see you've got the effective cap space pulled up there, and that's going to be the effective cap space that they have right now, include if after they paid their draft picks before they get if before Carlos Dunlap comes off the books. So June 2nd, that number should see a little jump to just
Okay.
over, into the 11, $12 million range.
Yeah, and effective cap space, as I understand it, is it's just accounting for some of those things that you talked about, right? And when you're looking at like before the draft, it was easy for me to say like, oh, I see why the Giants, for example, are a team that has a bigger gap between their actual cap space and their effective cap space, because they had to pay two top seven picks, and that was something being calculated into that. Is that right?
Absolutely, 100%.
how much do you look at the number also of like rostered players? Because that's like a number that you see here between effective cap space and active cap spending. And some teams, they have, I see as low of a number as 71 with the Bengals, and I see a high of a number as 81 here with a few teams, or I see one as 69, the Colts, so even lower than that. How big is that number? I mean, if it says that the Colts have 69 players, the Seahawks have 78 players, do the Seahawks have 90 players right now, or do you think over the cap is a little behind, or where does that stand?
Over the cap is probably a little bit behind. They probably don't have the undrafted free agents, which would push the Seahawks up over 90 if you put the 13 player class in there, and then they have the roster exemption for Aaron Donkor. This time of the off season, the number of players under contract is not as important because once you cross that 51 threshold, you no longer have to fill out to the 51 level to get to your top 51 cap hits. But if you were to flip over to this same page for 2023 or 2024, it's going to, if you look at the Seahawks in 2023, over the cap's going to tell you they've got 28 players under contract. Well, you have to have 51 to have top 51 cap hits. So you need to add 23 players at a league minimum salary of $750,000. So you're looking at another $17.25 million minimum of cap space that you would need. So it's one of those things where it's kind of like you touched on, where it's a picture in time. But it's fluctuating, and because of the way the cap works, we think about it as being for just a single season, but the cap it's a function of how a team wants to allocate its money over the next, that it has available to it over the next 5 years, as we see the Saints do every year, just kind of dip into that credit card and then live off of that for this year, and then next year we'll pull out a different credit card and start using the 2027 credit card. So
yeah, it's man, always got be careful, everyone. Don't go into debt. But it's funny because the one big name out there, I guess maybe two, but the one that people talk about the most with regards to quarterbacks is Baker Mayfield. And it's funny because the Browns, they have the most cap space, and they also are the team or the most effective cap space. The Panthers have the most, and obviously the Panthers are also a team talked about with Baker Mayfield the most often. And it's funny, I mean, the Browns are already paying his $18 million salary. So if they did manage to trade him, I'm assuming that would make their cap space go up even more. And it also seems like the only teams that would even be able to fathom a trade for Baker Mayfield or right now are like the Panthers and the Dolphins. And then if other teams were interested in actually paying him that $18 million, and if Baker Mayfield was agreeable to play on his salary, there's just not like a lot of teams. Is that even something that the Seahawks could consider?
They could consider it, but they'd have to make some changes, shift some things around, push some money into the future, some way or another, in order to accommodate that, assuming the Browns aren't willing to pick up a portion of that 18.9 million.
How does that work also? Because I used to think that was more of like a baseball thing or like an NBA thing. But in the NFL, a team can agree to take on any portion of a player's salary?
Yeah, what they would do is, because right now Baker Mayfield is set to play, or he's set to be on the Browns roster for 2022 on the 5th-year option. It's just an $18.9 million salary. What the Browns could do is could say, hey, Seahawks, if you'll take him, you send us a whatever draft pick or whatever, we'll convert of his 18.9 million in salary, we'll convert say 10 million of that to signing bonus. We'll pay that to him. We'll ship him to you, and then you pick up the $8.9 million salary while the 10 million stays with us as signing bonus.
Oh, okay.
Money, that's exactly what the Seahawks did with Jadeveon Clowney a couple of years ago. I forget if it was 7 or 8 million that Houston paid in signing bonus. The rest went on his base salary that Seattle transferred over to Seattle. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that does that makes sense then. Yeah, moving that money from a salary to a bonus, which is a thing that it took me a few years to like start to really understand that and the restructures. And even now I'm not 100% sure that I do, but I do, like I said before, these websites help a ton, and reading work like you've put out there, it helps a ton to be like with the NFL. To some degree, it seems like a lot of the stuff now that we've got, the 2011 CBA that set rookie pay scale, and the way that you can restructure a certain amount. And it's almost like with the NFL, it's a lot more rigid in the sense that you can maneuver here and there. You can do all these kinds of maneuvers to get under the cap space or to save cap space or to move players. But it's almost like I don't know how to best put it, like binary or whatever. It's just like, this is what you can do with the player. Like it seems almost simplified. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's very much so. I mean, it's you can make it as complicated as you want, but it's going to be a function of there's 4 or 5 things you can do total, and it's figuring out what those different, how putting those 4 or 5 pieces together to make the puzzle work, whether it's signing bonus, roster bonus, whatever, base salary, all of that. But it is pretty much, it's it's a very rigid, very structured system, which makes it very, not, I don't want to say easy to understand, but it's once you understand it, then the machinations and what you can kind of expect become a lot easier to predict and understand.
It looks like the Seahawks, as we said before, maybe between 6 and 7 million in effective cap space, and they've still got more decisions ahead. And there's people who talk about both players that could be cap casualties, like Chris Carson or Jason Myers, and also players that aren't on the cap yet, like Brandon Shell or I don't know what the status of Dwayne Brown would be. I don't think that the Seahawks are part of his plans, but in terms of maybe like, I don't even know if Brandon Shell would still be a part of the plans after drafting Abe Lucas and having a few other tackles on the team after last year, where it seems like maybe that wouldn't be the case. The Seahawks do have plenty of room to maneuver for a player like someone like Brandon Shell, though, right?
Yeah, if the Seahawks want to, they can get it done. They did a whole lot of this offseason where they'll, whether it's Quentin Jefferson or Al Woods, where even though they're bringing in guys on $4 or $5 million contracts per year, the first year cap hit is going to be 2 million or 3 million. It's not going to be anything prohibitive if they want it, on an individual basis. If they want to get something done with the player, they've got the smarts in the front office to structure it in a way that they can get it done.
And anyone out there who is watching live, since we are doing this live, if you feel like you want to chime in a question about the salary cap or the Seahawks cap situation, please take that opportunity to do it. I'll keep my eye there on the chat. Anybody out there that wants to chime in any sort of questions, and we'll see if we can answer them. As far as those decisions about whether the Seahawks retain $6 million in cap space for the season, or cut a player and make it more money, or sign a player and make it less money. Well, how does the rollover work? Like if there's teams out there, like say the Browns have $50 million or $40 million in cap space or $30 million in cap space, do they really get to roll over that entire amount into next year?
Yes, they do. So, and that's why you'll see situations where teams who are bad for a series of years and don't have the players who are worth extending, as we saw with the Niners years ago, the Browns years ago, Jacksonville, consistently throughout the last decade, is that they'll just, that cap space will roll over, and it comes to a point where they have to spend it at some point under the minimum spending thresholds. But if you have 30 million in unused cap space at the end of the year, or 5 million, you get to roll that entire amount over and put it on top of your cap for the next year.
The Seahawks would seem to be in a position next year then to have a ton of cap space. So whether they, they might have enough cap space, I'm assuming, and we'll get into it next year, to have the luxury to not worry necessarily about rolling over $5 or $6 million if they do get the opportunity to solidify, say, the right side of the offensive line, or take another chance at some more defensive line help, or whatever it may be. It seems like the Seahawks could, after training camp, or if that is a quarterback that comes into that monetary range of $5 or $6 million, which I don't know how many quarterbacks have ever existed in that sort of valuation that would actually be helpful. But the Seahawks would seemingly have some sort of options out there. The other name that I didn't mention before was Jimmy Garoppolo. where I said that there's maybe a couple of guys out there, and Jimmy Garoppolo, I believe, is like on a 24 or $25 million salary. I don't know how the 49ers would be able to really find any sort of trade partner for him. And there's some rumors that they're not going to even look to move Jimmy Garoppolo because they're not super confident with Trey Lance. Any thoughts on the 49ers and the Garoppolo situation? I think that there are, there's also just the whole fact that he's coming off of shoulder surgery.
I mean, it's obviously a big piece of it is he's coming off of shoulder surgery, but I think the other piece is too, coming back to another thing, coming back to the CBA, the 2011 CBA really drastically reduced, practice time during training camp during the regular season, and then we saw it again with the 2020 CBA, and I really have to wonder, how much of the 49ers reluctance to go to Trey Lance is the simple fact that, I mean, we knew he was raw coming into the league, and then how many practice reps did he actually get last season with Garoppolo as a starter? I mean, they only get 14 practices, padded practices during the year, and they're probably, you're a team that went to the NFC Championship game. You're not giving a whole lot of those practice reps to your backup quarterback because you're in contention down the stretch. And so it's, I my what I wonder is how much has he actually been on the field in practice? He may be barely, a little bit less raw than he was when we saw him. I mean, he played against Seattle last year and he looked awful. He had a strong arm, but his making the reads, delivering the ball, it was just not what you would expect for someone who has taken third overall. And if that's kind of what they're seeing in practice because he's not getting the reps in the game or in practice, then it's completely understandable that they might stick with Garoppolo. But then they're going to, I think at that point you're kind of looking at the same situation a year from now. So do you want to, take Garoppolo, who can get you close and can win, but we know he doesn't he doesn't have the physical skills of some of the other guys, or do you rip the Band-Aid off and hope that you don't go 3-14 because you've got a rookie quarterback or a first year starter or a quarterback who's not very good? So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, no, it's true. I'm starting. I was surprised that the 49ers drafted Trey Lance, and I have not really been given any reason to be like more optimistic about him necessarily because he hasn't played a lot. We don't know anything about him, and at the same time, I do think maybe he's going to be good. And this year may not be the year to do it. I just can't imagine that. Jimmy Garoppolo. I was shocked that the 49ers traded for Jimmy Garoppolo and then extended him. And it's still, more credit to Jimmy Garoppolo that he has lasted through almost that entire contract somehow and gotten to 2 NFC Championship games and a Super Bowl, I guess. But looking back at the Seahawks roster and sort of the money that they have, number one is kind of surprising, which is not just that Puna Ford is the highest paid player for this upcoming season, both in terms of base salary and cap hit, but that the number is only 10 million. It's like the Seahawks don't really have that because they don't have that quarterback anymore, and because they don't really have a ton of other stars that they've drafted and had to pay in the last 5 or 6 years. Puna Ford steps up there as the highest paid player, but he is in the last year of his contract. Some thought of, whether or not the team could extend him or should extend him. Where would you stand on whether or not the team should, work to keep Puna Ford around or, let him play out this final year?
At this point, I would probably let him play out the final year, and kind of see, how does he fit. He seems like he would be a fantastic fit in the system that they're moving to, but we haven't seen the system that they're moving to in action on the field. And so, before I'm committing big money or potentially big money to someone on another contract extension, I'd obviously want to see them on the field in action in the system that we're going to be using for the foreseeable future. So that's, I would not be surprised. I wouldn't hate it if they did it. I'm not going to go,
Right.
oh my God, they're done, write the season off. But it's one of those things where it's like, let's let him show what he can do. And then if he's good, if he performs as we think that he can, December, January, February, whatever, before free agency next year, great. Where are you at, Puna? And if the numbers work, you do it. And if they don't, okay, great. appreciate your time. Thanks. Have a good one.
Yeah,
You know,
sometimes it feels like, if there were any, I think you want to call them mistakes or just things in Pete and John's history over the last 12, 13 years that they would go like, oh, I guess I would do that differently. There was an eagerness to extend players maybe before they actually had to. And at least with Puna Ford, he's not 30, as you can see, he's like 27. I don't know what there's that side of it where it's like, if you actually believe that Puna Ford could come out next year and put out a 3-down season at defensive tackle where he posted 9 sacks and was a run stuffer, and you're like, wow, this guy's actually going to be worth more than 10 million per year, then you would want to get that done earlier. But given that is sort of the less likely possibility, you might as well. I don't know what the Seahawks would really have to gain or to lose by just waiting out one more year, like you said, and really see how it fits. With Tyler Lockett, 10 million as well. And I've always expressed some concern with receivers and age, mostly just that the teams seem to be phasing these guys out as they hit 30, 31. I mean, in the NFL, there's just not very many over 30 receivers at this point. And even right now on the free agent market, there's quite a number of interesting receivers who are 29, 30, 31. Even Will Fuller, I think, is like 28 or something like that, remains unsigned. Tyler Lockett, this upcoming year, age 30, a $3 million base salary. He's got those immense prorated bonus hits. So for anyone out there, you sign, you get a signing bonus, you spread it out. I believe, John, it's up to 5 years you can spread that out.
correct. Yep.
So you spread that out. And then the closer, you are to the end of that contract, the less of a dead money hit that you incur. But if the Seahawks were to, for unknown reasons, cut Tyler Lockett, right now, or trade him, they would have to pay all of those prorated bonuses combined in a dead money. Not like, I don't want to put it that way, because then it makes it sound like they're taking money out of their pocket. But the dead money left over would be 4 years worth. And if the Seahawks wait it out and just see how Tyler Lockett performs, there's really no out here for Tyler Lockett before 2024 without it incurring some dead money. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to be on the roster for the next couple of seasons at least, I would think, just because, I mean, it's, barring career-ending injury, it is significantly more expensive to get rid of him. Could you see it, like you said, after 2023, it becomes, a realistic discussion, because there is the actual possibility of cap savings, but there's not, I think we've all seen that he's lost the step, since his injury a few years back. And it's, his game is based off of, finding the open space and knowing defenses and reading it and knowing where he needs to be and being on the same page as Russell Wilson. We'll see if he can do the same thing with whoever the quarterback is in 2022. And if he can, and if it's, if his game is predicated on his intelligence and his ability to read defenses, as much as I think a lot of fans believe it is, as much as I believe it is, I think he'll see a production decline over the next couple of years, but I don't think it will be drastic.
Looking at it too, it's like, this is where things start to finally click for me. Sometimes I was terrible at math all throughout school. When I was a senior in high school, I was in freshman math just to get the credit so I could graduate. And then when I was a senior in college, exact same thing. But I can always add, subtract, divide. And it's you take the 4 prorated bonuses, that's $28.2 million. Then you add that to the $16 million in guaranteed salary, and you get $44.2 million in dead money if the Seahawks had to part with Tyler Lockett this year. So that finally where I started to click things in and go like I said, it's like, oh, this is rigid. This is like, you have a decision and it's based off things that are just like, this is the way that it is. It's not like you don't have to go through a bunch of hula hoops. You can do it on a website like this. And then next year, without that $16 million salary, without that, or it's guaranteed salary, and with one less year of the prorated bonus, it goes down to 21.15 in dead money, and then 14.1, and then 7.05, which is just the prorated bonus. So that's how you get to where you get with Tyler Lockett's situation. And we might as well just transition from Tyler Lockett to DK Metcalf, because when you do look at it, and this is why I think that the Seahawks should extend DK Metcalf, even if it is one of these, big $25 million per year salaries, because when you get to 2024, in the likelihood that the Seahawks part with Tyler Lockett by, say, 2024, when he'll be 32 years old. And look, I encourage him to be great until he's 36. I'm not pushing for Tyler Lockett to be cut. I'm just going with what could happen. And if the Seahawks had to, move that and save $9.85 million in salary, really, who's left on the roster to pay that money to? I mean, in 2024, the Seahawks are going to have, this isn't a fully accurate number when you've got 250. I'll highlight it. That's not a fully accurate number. We don't know what the salary cap is actually going to be for sure in 2024, and the Seahawks liabilities will change between now and 2024. But who else are they really going to pay? Can't really know for sure that Jamal Adams will still be around, but he might be one guy that's still around. Quandre Diggs may or may not still be around, and then there's just not really anyone else worth all that kind of money. So, John, where do you stand with, say, paying DK Metcalf? Because you could just as easily argue that if the trade return was really good, maybe you do entertain that.
See, my thing with DK is that, if you absolutely, if somebody sent an obnoxious trade package, a couple firsts and a second or in a third or whatever, you could consider it. But with DK, the whole point of getting those picks in return would be to replace DK, would be to draft a young receiver who's got, game breaking potential. And you've got DK, who's still only 24 years old. So it goes back to that Family Guy, it could be a boat, it could be anything, and so it's, you're basically trading DK, hoping that you can replace DK with DK, which just doesn't make sense to me. It's like, okay, we have DK Metcalf. He's fantastic. His production, he's got 3,100 receiving yards through his first 3 years in the NFL, which is top 20 in NFL history. That's top half of 1% in the top 1/2 of 1 percentile of the entire NFL history. And you're going to trade him and hope to replicate that? It's like, just pay the money and keep him, because who else on the roster, just like you said, is there to be worth paying? He's big. He's bought into the system. He's a believer in Pete, and he's a perfect match for the type of system that Pete wants to run. We can disagree with, what Pete wants to do and argue about, Pete's style and Pete's offense, this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, Pete's going to do what Pete's going to do because Pete's in charge, and DK fits his system perfectly. So
yeah,
you've got a puzzle. You've got a piece that fits. Pay what it takes to keep that piece. That's my opinion on it.
And really, it's like, if the plan is we set the stage now, bring in a quarterback next year or the year after, but probably next year, if that's the plan, and as you said, Tyler Lockett, maybe he's lost a step since the injury. He's going to be 31 next year. If you don't have DK Metcalf in there, what exactly is the attractive options at wide receiver for the next quarterback? Who is the guy supporting that player? Is it supposed to be, the Seahawks didn't draft a receiver this year, so it's not going to be some guy that's like emerging in his second year, and then we don't know anything about D. Eskridge. And if you draft a guy next year with one of your 2 first-round picks, perhaps, how many years is it going to take for that guy to become up to speed? And do you really want that to be the whole stage where it's like, not only do you have to bring along the quarterback and nurture the quarterback, but you also have to hope and nurture that the receiver is going to be as good as you want? Because DK Metcalf did get drafted after 6 other receivers. Nobody had a plan when they were going through that draft of, well, we're going to take Jalen Reagor, even though he's not as good as DK Metcalf. No, the Eagles thought they were getting a better player. It's like all those guys, Andy Isabella, who went ahead of DK Metcalf.
Yeah.
What's that?
I was just going to say Andy Isabella, and then you brought it up, and it's just, it's
absolutely
spot on,
It's just like best laid plans, right? You lucked into DK Metcalf. And so just have that guy around, because you need that's why you're saving so much money at the quarterback position, so you can pay these players that are rarities, as you say. And the Seahawks just don't have that many other players on the roster right now worth that sort of coin, looking at it now, where the Seahawks, they have, whatever they'll have this year. The other situations, let's talk about the potential cap casualties before getting into 2023 and what the Seahawks could do next year. I'm looking here for, obviously, let's start with Jason Myers, $4 million base salary. That's everything that the Seahawks would save if they cut him. But it just depends who would be replacing him. If the Seahawks have a player in camp who's going to be only cost $500,000 or whatever the minimum is, depending if it's that, or if the Seahawks, I don't know what sort of kickers could still be on the market that may be worth more than that, but there's the $4 million in savings, but then probably 500,000 to $1 million for replacing him. Is that right?
705,000 would be the absolute rookie minimum for this season. So, and it's, with only one kicker on the roster, you have to imagine that if they're going to look to save money at that position, I would have to imagine that it's through an extension as opposed to replacing Myers, at the season. Is it, I know a lot of fans are not keen on the idea of extending him at this point, but he's entering the fourth year of a 4-year contract, and I don't think a lot of us thought that he would make it this far into this contract. So,
right.
It's obvious the team seems to like him. Pete likes him. He's performed when they've, asked him to, and I don't see them making a change at kicker. Like I said, I think Myers will be around, and then I think they'll look to sign him next year again, and keep him for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and plus it's like kicker volatility, really. Next year could be Jason Myers' best season. It's just so hard to tell. And the next guy that you bring in, it's like going from Stephen Hauschka to Blair Walsh. That wasn't the best, right?
Nope.
So the other one, though, that makes a lot more sense would be Chris Carson. $4.5 million base salary, $1.5 million prorated bonus. It looks like he's got $425,000 in another kind of bonus. I'm not exactly sure what
those are the per game roster bonuses.
Okay, per game roster bonuses. It equals $6.1 million in a cap hit, and he's not really someone that would have to be replaced on the roster other than the players that are already on the roster. So it's not like the Seahawks would have to bring in somebody new if they decide to cut Chris Carson. Obviously, they're going to have Penny and Walker, and then they've got options with DJ Dallas and Travis Homer and so on. But Chris Carson remains. How much longer do you think Chris Carson will remain?
I would not be surprised. I think it's going to come down to his neck. What do the medical evaluations say? If he passes his physical, I think he at least is on the roster this season. And if he doesn't pass, if they look at his neck and they say no, whatever we did, it didn't heal properly, we're not comfortable putting you on the field, then I think that's whenever we get that, whenever the 6-month follow-up is from when he had his surgery, whenever he exactly had his surgery, whether it was October, November, sometime around then late in the season, 6 months is kind of from an orthopedic standpoint, when you want to look at it and figure it out. That's when they, made the decision with Cliff Averill when he had my understanding is a similar neck injury back in 2017. We all remember that. It was about 6 months later when they made the move to release him. So I would not be surprised if Carson is released sometime between now and the end of May. But like I said, that's assuming they don't like what they see on the physical. If they go in, they check everything out, they say, hey, you're good to be on the field. We'll see you at training camp. Then he's healthy. Pete loves him. They want to run the football a whole lot. I would not be surprised to see him as part of a 3-headed monster at running back this season.
And with all of the, as people say, running backs get injured. If you happen to need to go to, obviously Rashad Penny has not been a reliable player. If you happen to need to go to Kenneth Walker, and you don't just want to give it to Kenneth Walker. If you have the opportunity, if Chris Carson is healthy, there are going to be few better number 2, number 3 running backs in the NFL than Chris Carson if he is able to. Plus, it's like, really splitting. Now that you've got a 17-game schedule, it's only going to be more beneficial to have options that aren't necessarily, because I mean, I'm still of the opinion that some running backs have more talent than others, and that they do create a few more yards than maybe another guy. And there were those benefits to, even if you have a good team like the Seahawks had in 2013 and 2014 and 2012. There were those times where they wouldn't have won certain games if they weren't able to run the ball out in the fourth quarter. If they didn't have Marshawn Lynch there grinding out some of those yards to extend the play. I keep thinking about the game against the Ravens where Marshawn helped run down the final 8 minutes or whatever it felt like. And yeah, that pushes the when people say like, well, yeah, you can't say how many games you won where you rushed for over 100 yards because you're rushing in the fourth quarter. It's like, yeah, but the Seahawks weren't a team that were often able to run the ball out in the last few years without healthy quality running backs. And unfortunately, Chris Carson has rarely been all that healthy. And it is true that running backs have injury problems. It is the most brutal position, and that is an unfortunate reality for the guys who play it. If the Seahawks happen to get into the opportunity where they can afford to roster 3 starting running backs this year over a 17-game season, who knows if in the NFC they manage to get the number 7 seed or something like that, and then they have to play another game. It might be better to keep Chris Carson around. I mean, John, me and you we briefly talked about Sony Michel on Twitter today, and it's like he was beneficial to the Rams only because like they lost their running back and they had to make a trade, and they had to do what they had to do. They got desperate and they had to get a player in there, and Sony Michel was able to pick up those carries. So it's like the Rams were even a team that had 3 kind of starting capable running backs with Sony Michel, Cam Akers, and Darrell Henderson at one point, but because of injuries, it was only maybe like 1 or 2 of those guys.
It was who is exactly like you were talking about. They were all injured at some point during the year, and it was just a matter of who was available to take the to take the carries, as opposed to oh, we've got these 3-headed monster who's gonna tear the opponent apart this week. It was who's not in the hospital this week. So
exactly right. I mean, it's like it's good to have those options, and if DJ Dallas is the number 3 or the number 4, that's good too. There's also, and you said Carlos Dunlap's. This is going to be a post June 1, or what's the status here with Carlos Dunlap?
Dunlap was released with a post June 1 designation, so he will. So he stays on the salary cap. His base salary, you see it there, the 4.075 million, that will stay on the cap until June 2nd. June 2nd, that 4.075 plus the 1.025 non-prorated bonus will come off. So it's the 5.1 million in cap space that will be freed up. His 1.4 million for 2022 prorated bonus will stay on the cap for this season. And then because it's a post June 1 designation, his future years bonus prorations because he's got a couple void years on the end of the contract too. I believe it's 2023, 2024, and 2025. Those will all hit the cap in 2023. So he will 5.1 million in cap space will be added on June 2nd, and then he will be 4.2 million in dead money in 2023.
Okay, I see. And then the other one too might be Gabe Jackson. I mean, if the Seahawks, if there happens to be someone who beats them out for a job, or if the Seahawks just decide to keep getting younger or save money, that would be $6 million in savings, right? Or wait,
well,
no,
not this year, because Jackson's base salary is fully guaranteed this year.
Oh,
so
okay.
if someone beats him out, if Phil Haynes or whoever else beats him out, then I could see Jackson being traded for a day 3 pick. If another team were like, we're desperate for an experienced, high quality guard, then that $6 million would travel with Jackson and come off the Seahawks cap. But because it is fully guaranteed, if they release him, it's kind of that exact same situation we were talking about with Mayfield earlier. If they cut him, they're on the hook for that $6 million. So that's going to stay on the cap. So at that point, even if he loses the battle in camp, then if you're going to have to pay him, you might as well keep the depth on the roster and keep him around as a veteran, a leader who can tell, a very, very young offensive line group, show them how to be professionals.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is a unit that doesn't certainly lacks veterans and will be going through probably some of those growing pains next year. I mean, hopefully Charles Cross just comes in right away and dominates, and who knows? You know, we saw Rashawn Slater with the Chargers last year, but that is a rarity and exception. And you know, maybe the Seahawks with their new offense without Russell Wilson, maybe there will be actually I could see the job being maybe a little bit easier into the sense that maybe the offense will be a little bit more simplified and limited. And I don't know how many plays will Drew Lock and Geno Smith will be able to extend and make those guys work harder. And we'll see what happens there. Certainly the right side with all the uncertainty at right tackle and who's going to win that job. And you know, Austin Blythe wasn't even a starter last year in the NFL at center, and it'll be interesting to see how those competitions play out. So yeah, that part may make it difficult to part with Gabe Jackson. Looking at next year, the Seahawks. Gabe Jackson would be their second highest paid player for now. And as I said before, a lot of cap space, supposedly 82 million ish, maybe if they rolled over 6 million, you know, if they rolled over 5 million, maybe there would be even more. But we got to talk about sort of again, like how much real cap space is this? Like before I even get into that, like before we talk about what the Seahawks have to do to retain some of these players, is that like real cap space?
That's like we talked about before. That's, they're looking at 82 million with just 27 players under
Yeah.
contract. So obviously, I mean, it all depends upon where they end up this season. Because the more money that they more cap space they finish this season with, the more they'll have next year. But in reality, once they sign this year's rookie class, once they sign next year's draft class, and once they get through this season, extend DK, fill out the roster, all that stuff, you're probably looking somewhere very similar to where they were this offseason, where it's about $50 million in cap space that they have available, heading into free agency next year.
If the Seahawks were looking at that, because yeah, you know, 2 first-round picks, like I said with the Giants. I mean, if the Seahawks are really bad, one of those first-round picks will be very expensive. I mean, relatively speaking. I mean, I think a first year, like if you were talking about the number 1 pick, you'd be talking about probably like $12 million or
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, I mean, anything in the top 5, you're looking somewhere in the $10 million range.
Which is
Even
more
where
than
they were.
anyone they're paying.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, and even if the 10, even if they end up in the same spot, 9-10 range, they're looking at something that's going to be, probably about $5 million. And then to end of the round, assuming the Broncos make the wild card or whatever, something in the 20s is going to be, probably around $3 million. And that's just with those cap hits. And then you're going to have a couple $1 million for each of the second rounders as well. So
yeah, it's so yeah, they have to account for more money than they've ever really been used to with regards to rookie salary cap hits in 2023. But you've got Jamal Adams. I know that there's some upsettedness with not being an elite safety so far, but I would assume that he's going to stick around. There's certainly no financial benefit unless you did find, I guess, a trade partner next year. I think that at this point we could just assume maybe Jamal Adams sticks around. Shelby Harris, I don't know how well he would. I mean, if he plays really well, I mean, I guess you could keep him around. There wouldn't be necessarily benefit to, that. Then I don't know where the money's going to go. If you cut him, but we'll see how he plays. Because $9 million, that's all savings. That seems like a pretty good reason to probably just have a 1 year with Shelby Harris, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's let him play it out. He should be a fit in the system. He knows, he played for Fangio. He should know the system. It's one of those things where they're going to he's going to be around this year, and then see what he does. So.
And if we're starting to talk about, like, let's say that the Seahawks, had 50 million, we talked about some of that being allocated, some of those spendings already being allocated to DK Metcalf. If the Seahawks extended him at this point, now, if they just said, hey, we're going to wait and see how the season plays out because we always have the franchise tag next year. Nobody else is really going to be worth that franchise tag unless Drew Lock absolutely went off. I couldn't imagine anyone else being really worth that franchise tag. If you're worth a franchise tag as a receiver, if you're getting paid the average of the top 5 salaries now, I'm assuming that's over $20 million on a franchise tag for that. So that would be something that Metcalf uses in a negotiation.
Yeah, and it's the top 5 of the that year cap hits. It's not the average annual salary, so it's not, it wouldn't be 25 million or whatever it is of the top 5 average salaries right
Okay.
now. I think it was for Devontae Adams, I want to say it was 17.9. Assuming that goes up some, we'll probably be somewhere in the 18.5, $19 million next year would be my guess.
But if they
Which, yeah,
extend him, then that might only be like 7
10.
million.
Yeah,
Or yeah,
exactly.
okay.
Some significantly less.
Yeah. So that is a benefit to DK Metcalf and their negotiations to get all that guaranteed money right now. He'll have a lower cap hit in 2023, and the Seahawks will have more money to move around. But again, I don't know how many of these guys are really commanding that money. If Sidney Jones plays really well on his 1 year deal, maybe he would get $8 or $9 million. Drew Lock, I mean, obviously, that's just such a wild card. Ryan Neal, if he somehow played his way into another
Well,
contract,
even
Rashad Penny.
Ryan Neal will just be a restricted free agent. So if they want to keep
Oh
him
yeah.
around, they slap him. You hit him with a second round tender, and there's 2.5 or 3 million, whatever it is, and then he's not going anywhere. So
Yeah, so that's then the restricted area, which is usually reserved for undrafted free agents. Is that how it goes?
yeah, the restricted free agent is going to be the either undrafted free agents or players who did not finish out, drafted players who did not finish out their rookie contract,
Oh, okay.
cleared waivers, and then kind of bounced around, playing on 1 year contracts at a time. So.
But yeah, looking at everybody here, uh, you're hoping for some of these. Obviously, ignore these names that were just drafted, but you're hoping for guys to break out and deserve more money. But for the most part, it seems like the Seahawks aren't looking at a ton of impending contracts, and there's not a ton of contract extensions that they even have to really consider right now, other than DK Metcalf, Puna Ford. Some of these guys, obviously, they just signed to 1 year deals. Jason Myers would be one, like as you mentioned. But right now, it seems like the Seahawks, they're just going to have a ton of money to spend. They haven't been really very spendy in free agency. Before we go, John, what would you expect Pete Carroll to do if he had goes into next year? Let's say the Seahawks are coming off of a 7-10 season. They're gonna be excited about their rookie draft picks and all that kind of stuff. But after he signs, maybe he's already extended DK Metcalf and he's signed all the players that he wants to retain. If he has $40 million to spend, it would be so against everything we've seen before in terms of like going out there and then getting a bunch of free agents. But maybe as we saw with the Patriots last year, it would be finally the time to go out there and actually do it. Could you see the Seahawks actually being a spendy in the first wave of free agency next year?
I think they would do targeted spending. I think we haven't seen them, spend the big money, be the players and the guys who are in the monster contracts up front. But I think they would be players in the first wave for specific players at specific positions. If Drew Lock isn't the answer, then, are they going after a quarterback who is available, or are they looking to trade for a quarterback, and do kind of recreate the 2012 situation where they bring in a Matt Flynn and they draft a Russell Wilson, something along those lines where there's multiple pieces where they're trying to figure out what's going to be the best option, throw it all in together in camp, let them play it out, let the competition, bring the cream to the top, and then, hope that works in terms of building a competitive team for 2023.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because the Seahawks could have decided to stick with Russell Wilson. Maybe I don't. I mean, hard to say the entire situation, but that all of that cap space that the Seahawks now have decisions to make, they could either spend it on another quarterback who maybe like is the next Russell Wilson, a guy who needs a change of scenery. Lamar Jackson is probably the first name that came to mind as a guy who could potentially be on the market. But it's just like they could either spend it, it's like all that money. Now it's like they have an option, and that all would have gone to Russell Wilson if that was that 50 million in cap space, because that's where we're at with quarterbacks. And now it's kind of like choices, but the downside is you don't know that you have a good quarterback, and the upside is maybe you'll have a better one. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting.
Nope, exactly. I mean, it's you yeah, you've got to replace him, and obviously quarterback is the most important position on the field. So it comes down to how many shots are you going to give yourself to find that guy who could be, not necessarily
Yeah.
the next Russell Wilson, but a competent enough quarterback to to make you a competitive team.
John,
So.
can you tell people out there where they can find you and anything else you want to plug?
Hey, just always on Field Goals, always putting my thoughts there. You can follow me on Twitter at John P. Gilbert NFL for those of you who don't. But that's it. I appreciate you having me on, Kenneth. It's always good to talk ball, always good to talk, salary cap, all that stuff. So I don't know if I'm necessarily an expert. I probably know more than the average person, but I'm no Joel Corey or any of that. So.
Well, yeah,
I
don't sell
do
yourself
appreciate
too
that
short.
compliment.
No, well, always a pleasure to talk to you about football. I've learned more today, and I think that everyone out there listening and watching feels the same. So, yeah, go follow John on Twitter and check out fieldgoals.com. This is Seaside Joe on Twitter at Seaside Joe News and seasidejoe.substack.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show at some point with someone. Thank you for watching.
All right.